and go right ahead.
Okay, thanks so much for that introduction. Good evening, everyone. Biggest challenge for me, quite honestly, is to find a way to distill what is a very complex topic into a short amount of time. You're going to notice in terms of like style of approach to the presentation is you won't see slides with bullet points on them. I really like to take an approach that's a bit more storytelling and try to get to the heart and peel back the layers of talking about the caregiver experience. So hopefully it's you're gaining a deeper level of insight around family care. For those of you who are interested in tonight's topic, I assume that you've had a level of exposure to talking about caregiving. So just to give you some perspective on me, both personally and professionally, that's a photo of my brothers and I with my father. The sad news is actually that my father passed away last week from a long battle with cancer. He fought hard for 6 years with kidney cancer when they only gave him a few years to live. And that's actually us a number of days before he passed. So that experience of being with him and kind of being in a pseudo caregiver role, and I'll talk about why I said pseudo, it's had an impact on me and certainly had an impact on my family. I'm lucky from the perspective of my family that I have 2 siblings, so it's always been easier for us to kind of share the care. And my caregiver journey, traces way back to 12 years old. That's 30 years ago when my mother had been diagnosed with bipolar disorder. And my father, at the time, who was the sole breadwinner, really had very limited access to resources, very limited access to support, and often turned to us as young kids to try to, mediate and support my mother through this experience. So I can remember very vividly, being asked to stay home from school. And my mother was in, bouts of depression, when my father was worried about, being potentially suicidal. So the caregiver experience permeates and has permeated my entire life. And if you talk to most caregivers, they'll talk about the impacts that it has on them. It certainly had a major impact on me in terms of my sense of family, my sense of my own identity, my sense of my relationship to the world around me. And I'll talk about some of the lessons learned from that. In addition to my personal experience, I've been working in the family caregiver space going back to 2000, tracing back to a public health institute where I was doing both research and developing new models of practice for caregivers, which is where we initially built the Caregiver Network, an online learning network to support caregivers, and also led to the outgrowth of Huddle, which I'll talk about a bit later on. You should know that in addition to talking about Huddle later, our collaborative community, health community, that our learning network still exists. It's accessible at events.huddle.com. And there you can kind of get access to almost 500 recorded learning events that talk about so many facets of the caregiver experience, in addition to, as I mentioned, accessing to our community. So, my work is traced over research, looking at and understanding the caregiver experience kind of from end to end, people who, preparedness around family care, post-caregiving, what happens after you lose a loved one and how that affects your identity, pretty much everything in between. I've had the good fortune of being involved in developing policy around family care in Canada, and then working on some broader scale communication initiatives to bring more awareness to the role of family caregivers. I think one of the areas where there's still a lot of work to do is to bring more recognition to the importance that caregivers play, not only in society, because I think we've done a good job of framing this as a moral issue that caregivers need support, but also as a health issue. Because as we probably all know, more and more care is being provided in communities. There's a big push towards less institutional care. People really want to be cared for in their home. That's a wonderful thing, but ultimately a lot of that responsibility falls on oftentimes a primary caregiver and sometimes extended members of the family. So kind of let's jump into it and talk about, kind of different facets of the caregiver experience. I mean, that looks like a very big existential question, who am I? But it's a very, very big question that, kind of ping pongs in the brains of caregivers. We oftentimes talk about the caregiver identity. And one of the most difficult parts about reaching into the caregiver community is that most people fundamentally just don't see themselves as caregivers. And they don't see themselves as caregivers because they just tend to associate with the family role. They'll see themselves as a son or a brother or as a parent or a grandparent or anywhere along that spectrum. And that's typically the case certainly early on in the experience of providing care, when maybe the responsibility is not quite so intense. But what we've seen is as the intensity increases, as the responsibilities start to increase, caregivers sometimes go through this shift where they start expanding their view of going from this or transitioning from a family member and taking on more of this caregiver identity. From our perspective, really, the moment you're caring for someone who has a loss of autonomy, a health problem, from our definition, you're really a caregiver. And to be quite honest with you, I don't think it matters whether or not the person sees themselves as a caregiver in a literal sense, because I think for some people that connotation can be, in a way, uncomfortable for some people. They don't want to see themselves as a caregiver because they feel like somehow that is a compromise of their family role or their family identity. I'm not a caregiver, I'm this person's wife. This is what I'm supposed to do. There's a filial obligation. And that's absolutely fine and understandable. But I think it's important to also recognize that there often is a transition, that the expectations we have on typical family roles can grow and expand very quickly when you're taking on a caregiver role. No one expects that a wife is going to know how to provide nursing care or to bathe a husband or to provide palliative support or end-of-life support or know how to navigate a very complex healthcare system. And that oftentimes really becomes more of that caregiver side of your experience. So we talk about this transition, this identity shift from seeing ourselves as a family member to integrating the caregiver role. The one thing I will say that is important in that transition or in that integration is as you start recognizing yourself as a caregiver, you start being able to feel like you might have the right to have a voice, to be more active in a process. And the other good thing about recognizing yourself as a caregiver is that you can work with people around you to set limits. Sometimes when you're really in the family mindset, you feel this, filial obligation to fulfill all of the responsibilities for the person. And as you start seeing yourself as a caregiver and providing these instrumental supports, you might start seeking out additional supports around you just by taking on this new identity shift. The other thing with the transition to identity in terms of becoming a caregiver, I think, which makes some people uncomfortable, is that it also can mean that your relationship with the person is changing. That means that you may have to abandon or let go of certain ideas that you might have about this person, or some, limits or constraints that come along with the health issue that could impact on communication, future planning, sexuality, family dynamics, workplace. It's really, as the responsibility intensifies, as the person often who may be losing their autonomy or experiencing losses, it can have a deep impact on the relationship. So what's important to recognize is that the caregiver role will call upon you to do things that really often exceed the typical family relationships. So intuiting and understanding and accepting your role as a caregiver can in some ways make the process more coherent and give you a different framework to work from that expands beyond, again, that typical family role, and help you deal with also some of the tensions that come with the shift. Because again, sometimes it's easier to cope with a mindset of being a caregiver than to cope strictly in a mindset of being a wife, a brother, a sister, which comes with its own sense of like, this is what that should look like. Versus when you start looking at through a caregiver lens, it opens up to possibilities of, okay, I can understand my role in this way a little bit differently. So, one of the things that is intense with being a caregiver is that, you're going to have a direct experience of someone else's suffering. The reason I've used the book of Job as a reference is because, for those of you that don't know, Job is one of the books in the Bible that deals with the issue of suffering, and it's a story of Job, who's, exposed to this a pious person whose life is turned inside out. It's, there's a kind of a gamble between the devil and God about what would happen if Job was exposed to all this suffering. Would he continue to be a devout person? And it talks about just kind of the experience of being human and going through experiences of suffering, which is very much aligned with this caregiver experience. There's this kind of existential confrontation that happens when you witness someone that you love experiencing some kind of life-limiting experience. And what that can do is create a sense of powerlessness in the person who's providing care. Because oftentimes, as much as you're taking positive steps, proactive steps to seek out treatment, to seek out resources, the disease may change. So, for example, there was nothing I could have done to alter my father's outcome. We knew that he was diagnosed with a cancer that, would have, where treatment would have limited benefits, but ultimately he was not going to go into remission. So, the vividness of a health issue is something that caregivers have to deal with on a daily basis, and it forces them to kind of contemplate, and sometimes in a very existential way, what it means to live in a state of suffering. And when it comes to to cancer, even in the experience of treatment, dealing with issues around side effects or seeing vivid changes in someone's physicality or in their temperament, because the person you're caring for is going through a shift as well. It's affecting their self-perception, their sense of identity. It may be impacting on their work, and all of those things start to have an impact on their view of the world and their view of themselves. And by extension, that experience of their suffering is also having a resonating impact on you as well, because you're going to go through your own experience of loss, hopefully with the best outcome. But even in that transition towards remission, or where treatment is taking a positive effect, you're going to go through those living losses. So what we know about family care is that it creeps into all facets of your life. It can have an impact on work. Just to put in perspective for you, over 500,000 Canadians, the last stats we have is that over 500,000 Canadians back in 2015 had to leave work to provide care. What most employers don't realize is that this is probably one of the major issues affecting the labor force. And especially given that we're living in a rapidly aging society where more and more adult children are providing care to aging parents and sometimes providing care to young children as well. It's also going to have an impact on your social life. Forget just the obligations related to medical appointments, care, seeing specialists. It starts to and can create the sense of isolation, where there's this kind of withdrawal. And that can be a byproduct of the emotional toll it's taking on you. It can be a byproduct of, extended family and friends not fully understanding what's going on or feeling intimidated by what's going on, not knowing what to say when. And slowly but surely what we see among a lot of caregivers is they start to withdraw. Obviously, we're trying to proactively advocate for caregivers to grow their social support network rather than let it diminish. But the nature of a health issue, especially when it's something that's very, very particular, very, very noticeable, can have this isolating effect where caregivers start to withdraw and cut off social ties. This will also affect your extended family. It will have an impact on your children. It'll impact how you speak with them. It will impact on their perception of the person dealing with the health problem. I saw this very clearly when we lost my father and the impact that it had on my brother's children and his dynamic between him and his children. For example, them witnessing his grief was a very powerful experience for them. The other thing is that it's going to have an impact on your emotional state and on your mind, because it will weigh on your mind. Forget just the commitments that will grow with time and all of the new care-related responsibilities that you'll take on. It's just the weight of the unknown, the weight of not knowing if a treatment's going to work, or if you'll get an appointment on time, or if someone needs to be accompanied to the hospital. So it's not an easy juggling act to marry a caregiver responsibility with all of the other existing obligations that you have. And the last piece is that we know that caregiving can have a major impact on your physical health. The intensity of the responsibility. Sometimes, I know a lot of people don't like this word, but the intensity of the responsibility, sometimes called burden, don't love that word, but the feeling of, when will this end? And I don't mean end negatively, but when will things get better? When will we see the light at the end of the tunnel and know that this person is going to get better? So all of these things combined can create a kind of tension between how things are in your current life and kind of how you want them to be. So caregiving will force you to address a confrontation between your hopes, your dreams, your expectations, and a very vivid reality that's in front of you. I think this picture is very, very accurate for a lot of caregivers who feel sometimes in this very solitary world of trying to keep the person they're caring for propped up. You're going to have to be a coach, a motivational speaker, a supporter, a system mediator, and it's going to feel sometimes like you're faced with this hurricane of stuff around you, and you're just trying to keep your world together. I say that because I want to normalize this for caregivers as well, and recognize that that's often the case when you're just trying to hold the threads together. You have to be that one person where everyone else can kind of check out at the end of the day. You're the person who refuses to let go. And you're going to come up against different challenges in your caregiver experience. You're going to come up against healthcare systems. Sometimes they're going to be great. Sometimes they're not going to be great. I've learned that when it comes to acute care in Canada, we do great. When it comes to chronic care in Canada, we struggle. You're going to come up against healthcare professionals who are, astute and responsible and conscientious, and you're going to come up against some who are burnt out and overwhelmed. And you have to navigate those waters of being, a strong advocate for the person in your care. And you're going to have to try to figure out within those healthcare systems, what you feel comfortable saying and how to advocate positively. And I'll talk about that a little bit later on. The other thing is that you're going to have to deal with the expectations of your family around you. Family conflict is not uncommon in caregiving situations where people have different wishes and wants, or think that someone should approach treatment in a certain way, or they should be planning in a certain way. There can also be conflicts around issues related to money. The tension that's created, even in a cancer diagnosis, can create this kind of erosion in families. And as I mentioned earlier, you're also dealing with a dwindling social circle. You might start feeling more and more like you're the one person who's trying to keep things together. You're going to deal with good and bad information. You're going to get all kinds of information, even from healthcare professionals. Sometimes that information will be accurate. Sometimes it will be a little misaligned. So you're going to have to be really proactive about seeking a range of information. And that includes from people who have been through the experience as well. And that fundamentally, in many instances with caregiving, is you're kind of planning for an unknown future. We did not know, for example, when my father was going to pass. And about 2 months before he did pass, we had to figure out what to do with his apartment. His lease was coming up for renewal. We had no real idea if he would ever go back home. That might sound like a minor issue, but it was major to us because we didn't want to be in a situation where he was ready to leave the hospital and he had nowhere to go. So those little considerations as you move through the care experience can have big ramifications and create kind of big pressure on people. So, one of the things I hear often from caregivers consistently is, I wish I would have known, or, I have no sense of what services are available. I'm not here to tell you that every service is out there that will respond to every one of your needs. There's big gaps in respite services. There's big gaps, as I mentioned, like chronic care related services. But there are services out there, and caregivers who are very strategic can build a supportive network around themselves. At a very fundamental level, the first place to turn is to friends and family. You know, turn to your turn to your low-hanging fruit, the people around you who get it, who are compassionate, who can support you in the experience. We know that that's not always easy for caregivers to do. A lot of caregivers feel very private. They don't want to talk about the health issue of the person they're caring for. And again, so they start kind of retreating to themselves. That can be where you start getting into dangerous territory with family care, when you feel like no one else can possibly do what I can do when it comes to dad, my husband, my son, my wife. You have to find a way to capitalize on the resources that exist around you, especially the more, what we call, those informal of those family resources. Community support services, turning to health charities, turning to organizations that are specifically committed to either understanding the cancer care journey, understanding the caregiver experience. There are a multitude of them. They do amazing work, whether it's accessing a support group, accessing information resources, learning more about the disease, learning more about treatment options, activities like webinars like these, where you start to grow your knowledge base about understanding the different facets of the care experience and the disease and the patient's wellness, or the person's, who you're caring for's wellness. Public health system support. Difficult to talk about it specifically because every province is different in terms of how they provide public health supports and entryways into the public health system. But every province has public health services. They can be difficult to access. They're often filled with waiting lists. That's why it's really important that you be proactive early on, because you may end up waiting for services. And then finally, where people have the capacity, there are options around private care. So if you need someone to come into the house and help with cleaning, providing you a measure of support, whether that means providing you some respite and time off from care, private resources, and there are a multitude of them, obviously they're growing, are accessible as well. Yes, there's a cost to them, but also important to remember that there are a range of tax benefits available to caregivers. So despite there not being enough, there are some which can offset some of the costs and expenses that caregivers take on. The one thing I would say is that, in a journey that's going to be filled with a multitude of different options, and you're not always sure where to go first, we try to encourage caregivers to think about the one thing that's going to make their lives easier right now. So kind of doing your own audit of the one thing that's weighing most on your mind, that you have a sense of control over. So certainly everyone would like to say, I wish the cancer would go away. That may not always be something that you can kind of snap your fingers and make happen. But if there's one thing that's creating pressure, creating tension, creating this feeling of overwhelming, to really focus your energies on that one thing and ask yourself, what's the one thing I can do right now that would make everything else easier or make other things unnecessary? Because the truth is that you're not going to be able to sustain this kind of, diffuse awareness where you're focused on a million things at once, because that generally is a recipe for burnout. You're going to have to start narrowing your attention on the one, I call it like the domino effect. What's the next domino I can push to make this process go more smoothly, excuse me. The other thing I want to talk about is the concept of advocacy. We often hear about patient advocacy and helping patients find a voice. I'm all about caregiver advocacy, especially as the person who's diagnosed starts losing their ability to speak on their behalf. Maybe they're dealing with the effects of chemotherapy. Maybe they're starting to experience losses of autonomy. For example, my father could have never advocated for himself in the last 2 to 3 months of his life. He was too weak to be able to really ask for what he needed, and his family became his voice. So find your voice, and when you do, fill the damn silence. Going into appointments, going into meetings with healthcare professionals, doctors, specialists, and feeling that sense of intimidation can be detrimental to your experience. Ask a lot of questions. Be very inquisitive. I'm not suggesting we shouldn't trust healthcare professionals, but they're not infallible. They make mistakes. They forget to say things. As caregivers, we have to advocate on behalf of the person who's unable to advocate for themselves. And that's not just limited to healthcare networks. That could be with accessing treatments and talking to decision makers at provincial or federal governments. That can be working with health charities and getting more active in an advocacy movement to make sure that we get access, to the best possible treatments. But what I would say to caregivers is, don't be shy in this process. Recognize that you're integral to this process. Make sure that everyone around you knows that you intend to be a part of the process and be an active care partner in this. And it's unfortunately often falls on the caregiver to remind healthcare professionals and the surrounding networks that you are in the middle of this journey. There's no one who is closer to the person who has been diagnosed than you. You know a lot about what's going on with them. You understand their needs. You understand the impact of treatment. You understand the progression of the disease. You know what good days look like. You know what bad days could look like. All of that means that you are absolutely essential in trying to promote better outcomes. I know, for example, and I've spoken to doctors in confidence about this, I would never let a loved one go into hospital by themselves. There are too many variables when you go into healthcare networks to have someone who is feeling already, weakened by an illness or feeling disempowered, to let them go into this experience by themselves. So it's important as caregivers that we recognize, number one, we have a right to advocate. We have a right to ask. We have a right to ask people to take responsibility and to get engaged in the process, especially when it comes to how care is going to unfold. So I encourage you to find that voice. We've done a lot of work around family caregiver advocacy, from understanding the sense of identity about being a caregiver to how to talk within healthcare networks. And there's a ton of free webcasts and recordings on events.huddle.com that you can check out to talk about advocacy. So that's a bit about what I wanted to share from a family caregiver perspective, just in terms of some of the opportunities and some of the challenges that we've seen come along with this experience of care. And what I want to jump into next is sharing with you what we're working on with Huddle, so you have a better understanding of kind of what the Huddle community looks like, what our Huddle collaboration network looks like. I know there was a question earlier on. So I just see earlier on, I'm sorry, I'm just reflecting on a question here. So someone was asking about getting more information about becoming a healthcare partner on the Huddle network. So I'll share that with you. I'll talk about how we work in the Huddle community to not only bring caregivers together with caregivers, we've also opened up the network to people dealing with health issues. So you notice I'm trying to avoid the word patient. I don't like the word. I try to avoid using it because I feel like it disempowers people, so I don't use it. But Huddle brings together people with health issues, brings caregivers with caregivers, and also there's a network of healthcare providers inside the network and a network of health charities inside the network. So I'm going to share with you what Huddle looks like. I'm going to assume that you can see my screen. If you can't, just pop out a comment or a question. We started building Huddle back in 2016, and I'll give you an idea of what the impetus for building Huddle was. And it goes back to our core beliefs. Our core beliefs are that if we're going to empower people in a health experience, we have to validate their experience. We have to make their experience count, which means that your lived experience as a caregiver or a person with a health issue has to be at the center of how we build healthcare systems, how we facilitate interactions between healthcare professionals and people dealing with or navigating a health-related experience, whether on the care side or dealing with the experience themselves. So what Huddle really is about is to bring together your lived experience, with the learned experience of experts in a complementary network. We don't believe that a doctor's insight is more important than your insight. We believe that it's complementary to your insight. So, I can tell you, for example, the things that I've learned the most about the caregiver journey was not necessarily from healthcare professionals. It was from caregivers themselves. They develop an amazing expertise as they navigate sometimes years of caregiving. I could bet that I could tap your brain trust today and talk about the impact of chemotherapy treatment, or what impact it's had on your work and what you learned about how to mitigate the effects of that. You gather all of this amazing intelligence and wisdom as you go through the experience. So what Huddle is really trying to do is to capitalize on all of that smarts and bring it into one cohesive network. So when you come to huddle.com, all of this is free. It will always be free. To join is really easy. You can share your email address. We guard your email, very diligently. We protect your privacy very diligently. I would encourage you to read our terms of use and privacy policy. We're really focused on making sure that we protect our members. You can join Huddle anonymously, which is great. So if you're feeling uncomfortable about talking very publicly, you can join it anonymously. And really, once you give your email, we'll ask you to create a password, and then pretty much you'll jump into the community. We're about to make a small change to this onboarding process. Really, the change is really, the goal is to make it even easier. So I'm going to log in with my account and kind of give you a really quick tour of Huddle. We won't have time today to go in depth on the Huddle community. So what you're seeing here, I'm just going to slide some things over that I'm seeing from the webinar over so I can get a full view. What you're seeing here is my Huddle Dashboard. So this is like, central command for Mark Stolow's Huddle community experience. On the left-hand side, I can see some people that are online and active. On the top section, you can see the communities I belong to and some people I'm connected to and topics that I follow. So the backbone of Huddle in terms of networking is joining communities, connecting with people, and following topics. So, for example, if I really wanted to have a cancer-focused experience on Huddle, I could go into Huddle and search for the word cancer, and I can generate all these results based on just that simple search. So, for example, I can see here, interestingly enough, so SurvivorNet is one of the health charities on Huddle. We have about, I think we're going on close to 50 or 60 health charities on Huddle, a number of cancer-related organizations, including the Quebec Breast Cancer Foundation, SurvivorNet, among others. So I can see some of the posts that have been shared around the topic of cancer. I can see some of the topics that relate to cancer, and I can follow those topics. And what that means is that anytime someone creates content around those topics, it will become a part of my network or my dashboard feed, so I can keep up to date with what people are sharing around cancer. And I can also see different people that are related to the cancer. So, for example, Yulene, 72, is living with stage 4 breast cancer. So I can connect with her and share with her through posting or through messaging. So, and then in addition to that, I can see some of the communities related to cancer. So, like, for example, we have a blood cancer community, a breast cancer community. So right now, for example, I can see that there's about 6 communities that are just focused on the topic of cancer. But it's important to know that the communities on Huddle go way beyond just the disease. So, for example, if I'm interested in mindfulness and as a practice to deal with stress, I can also jump into communities that deal with mindfulness. So we have a community entirely dealing with the topic of mindfulness. So it's an eclectic mix of all things health and wellness. And you can decide when you build your network on Huddle how specific you want it to be or how broad you want it to be. That's entirely up to you. So you could be very cancer focused. You could be much more generally health focused. It's entirely up to you. So in addition to kind of connecting through these various touch points on Huddle, excuse me, you'll notice that all of these elements at the lower part of your screen, these are active threads. These are things that people have posted and they're talking about. So, for example, Richard Steele, who works at the Alzheimer's Society of Montreal, has been talking about daily life with dementia. Not so relevant to our conversation today around cancer, but just to give you a sense. So people can make contributions within this thread. So Richard's made a bunch of his own contributions, or other people can go and contribute within those specific threads. I can tell you, for example, Donna Thompson is a very strong caregiver advocate. Kim C is a parent living, I think, in the middle part of Canada, and she's caring for a child with a developmental disability. There's just a range of people. So we've got health charities sharing perspectives. We've got healthcare organizations and companies sharing perspectives. And of course, as importantly, we have caregivers and people dealing with health issues sharing their perspective. So that just kind of in a nutshell is just the lay of the land around Huddle. If you want to activate something on Huddle and kind of post to Huddle, you can start something, share the community what you're looking for. So you can ask a question, you can share a perspective, you can share a story, you can fundamentally, what we're trying to do is to build these collaborative networks. So if you have a question for healthcare professionals on Huddle, ask it. And the goal of our network is to bring the healthcare professionals to you so you can get an answer for your question. So it's kind of just like the basics of how Huddle works. There are messaging tools on Huddle where you can message one-to-one with members. You can group message with members. We often host live chats on Huddle. And the way a good network should work, a knowledge network should work, is we try to keep you notified of things that are going on in your network. So you'll get your own notification feed that will tell you, what people are up to, what they're sharing. But fundamentally, the goal is for you to grow your network on Huddle and just get smarter, more informed, more connected, more supported. And we're trying to get better and better at building Huddle in such a way that we wrap the community around you for the support that you need. So those are kind of the basics of Huddle. The one unique feature of Huddle, I won't dive into it too much tonight. We're currently in a beta test, which means that we're testing this concept with a small group of people. It's something called the collaboration economy. So Huddle is all about the positive impact that members have on each other. And I think the one thing you'll notice when you come to Huddle is people are very conscientious, compassionate, courteous, which unfortunately is not what you get in some networks. So when you dive into some networks, you may get exposed to a lot of vitriol, sometimes meanness. We don't get that on Huddle. People are very kind and caring because people come with the intention to go through a more healing, supportive experience. So underpinning our collaboration network is the collaboration economy. You might have noticed that under my name here, there's tokens that we award and there's points that you can earn. What we're doing with the collaboration network is essentially rewarding people for having a positive impact on other members. So for example, I can give you a use case example. We have health charities that are on Huddle who are having a positive influence on their members, and we award them with tokens that they can then convert into actual dollars to support their mission. Now, those tokens are also available to our everyday members. So you can actually be rewarded for having a positive impact on people in the community. One of the things that we're working on next for Huddle is actually building a marketplace at Huddle where you'll be able to take the tokens that you earn for your positive impact and convert them into actual health and wellness services. So again, with our goal of creating this continuity between the way community members support and care for each other and rewarding them for that positive impact. The other thing you're going to notice on Huddle is this points earned. So every time you do something positive on Huddle, you earn points. So if you connect to someone, you earn points. If you post, you earn points. If you contribute to a post, you earn points. And what that does is it creates something called your personal impact rating. So every member of Huddle carries with them a peer rating, which measures the positive impact that you're having on other members. And that peer grows with time. So it's a percentile rank from a 0 to 100 that reflects what kind of positive influence you're generally having on the community. And your peer rating also influences how you receive token reward based on the contributions that you're making. I won't delve into it too much, but I'm happy if you want to email me after the event at mark@huddle.com, and we can kind of give you a demo and a tour, a more detailed tour of the platform. But fundamentally, what we are trying to do is to create a positive impact network where people are helping people along a health and wellness journey. I'm noticing there's a couple of questions that came through, so I just want to address it, and I think it's an important question. So the question is how does Huddle deal with a member posting that contains medically questionable or even dangerous advice? It's a really good question. One of the challenges when you create an open network like Huddle is this issue of what are people going to share? I'll tell you our perspective on it, and I'll tell you what we do to try to mitigate those types of issues. So it's important to understand that Huddle is an open network. We do not validate or verify the information that people are sharing. What we do is have a network of community managers, including healthcare professionals, who are not only there to activate and support the community, but are also there to observe and watch. So number one, people can report on content that they feel is malicious or dangerous. So if someone's sharing information, I can report on the content. I can also, so as you see here, I can report. So let's say, for example, Kim C had shared something that I thought was questionable. That content can be reported to us. If that content is in breach of our terms of use or our privacy policy, we address it directly with the member, ask them to course correct, and if they don't, we ask them to leave the community. I can tell you that in this soft launch that we've had with Huddle since our limited launch, meaning that we've been growing the community slowly, we've only had to ask 2 of 10,000 people to leave. And I would say that the issues were a little bit marginal at best. They weren't very egregious. So We don't control the flow of information, but we observe and watch, and we allow community members to report. The other good thing that happens when you build a network that includes healthcare professionals is that they also serve in a kind of course-correcting way. So what we have seen is where people are sharing information, where they're kind of mistaking opinion for evidence or opinion for fact, the professionals will step in and help people rethink or reframe what's being talked about. But I can tell you that it rarely happens. We don't see a lot of medical advice being dispensed on Huddle. What we see is more psychoeducational advice. So rather than someone saying, eating 5 apples a day has cured my cancer, which we haven't seen, fortunately, people will talk about the benefits of nutrition in terms of dealing with, the symptoms of cancer. So we don't have doctors on Huddle prescribing medical advice, and our terms of use say very explicitly that if you receive medical advice on Huddle, you really should take it with a very strong grain of salt and consult with your doctor. So we're trying to be mindful of what people are sharing, but we also recognize that people will share what they will share. And sometimes it's important to create exposure around people's maybe, ideas that might be unsubstantiated, and give the opportunity for the community to share feedback about, what is an opinion versus what is, evidence-based information. Having said that, it doesn't mean that person's personal experience is not critical to that sharing on Huddle, but certainly we try to make sure that the information coming through is set within a proper context. Sorry, I see there's another comment. So someone shared that, and I'll just keep it in confidence, just as a matter of respect, but talking about providing, care to her sister, and experiencing almost like a post-traumatic stress, and feeling like she's living out the experience of caring for her sister in an ongoing way. And she says this Huddle group would have been really useful. Our goal, I hear this unfortunately too often, that caregivers after the fact, unfortunately hear about support resources. Obviously, we want to try to reach as many people in advance as possible. The hardest time to help a caregiver is when they're in that crisis. I'm hoping that for the person who posted that, that they find reconciliation, and are able to, eventually move beyond that sense of trauma that comes with losing someone. I can tell you, for example, in my family, I've seen that same experience, almost a kind of PTSD that comes out of watching someone suffer. It's incredibly vivid to watch someone go through an experience of suffering, especially when you have a sense of powerlessness that's associated with that experience. We could probably spend an entire hour just talking about, how to mitigate and move through suffering when you feel out of control. But I appreciate that person sharing that experience. So what's important to know about Huddle is it's really a space for our members. If you come onto Huddle, if you're having trouble navigating the experience, we have community support people always available to help you navigate. If you feel like you're sharing something and it's not getting into the hands of the people you want, we will proactively engage with you and try to get the network to come to you and really respond. But our vision for Huddle is to really grow this very powerful, positive health and wellness space where people always feel like they have someone who has their back all the time. And I think to the point of this person's comment, it's critically important that when you deal with what can be a very narrowing experience, where your world starts to feel like it's getting smaller and smaller, that you just know, even if it's for the sake of your own mental sanity, that you're really just a quick stone throw away from someone who has a listening ear, who can totally empathize with what you're going through, or can even provide some guidance or some advice based on either their own lived experience or to get some expert guidance as well. So I can tell you, for example, of our 10,000 or so members, as we've been building up Huddle slowly, almost about 1,000 of those members are represented by a range of healthcare professionals. And we have nurses inside of the community who are very active. We have OTs, social workers, wellness experts, nutrition experts, and more and more and more our intention is to grow, in addition to our lay community, is to grow that expert community and to really create a healthy blend of those two together. So I appreciate, all of you taking the time tonight. I realized I had to actually ask the host to move the event to 8, so I appreciate the accommodating me and the time. I know it can be late. Don't be shy to reach out. Like I said, my email is mark@huddle.com. That's mark@huddle.com. I'd love to hear your feedback about tonight. If there's anything else that resonated with you, if you have questions about Huddle, and I can imagine you have a bunch more, don't be shy to reach out. People often ask us to want to better understand, for example, the collaboration economy and how that works, because we're trying to provide benefits to help charities as well through that. So we're happy to answer all of your questions. So I really appreciate you taking the time to connect with us tonight. And hopefully I'll meet you and connect with you on Huddle. As you can see, you can find me just by clicking on you join the community and just search for Mark Stolow, and I'm happy to be your first point of connection inside of the community. So thanks everyone for tonight, and I wish you, wherever you are in Canada, a good end of the day or a good night.